Hi, I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. Welcome to Unveiling Death. The door that's open, from AIDS clinic to skydiving and more, with Michelle Fiordaliso. Michelle Fiordaliso is an award-winning writer and filmmaker with a degree in clinical social work and psychotherapy. She is also a birth and death doula, ushering people through the major transitions of life, while also coaching executives through the smaller transitions of life, like starting companies, mergers and acquisitions, and successful exits. Her writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, Ms., and elsewhere. Michelle is the co-author of Everything You Always Wanted to Know About X, a self-help book on how to deal with past relationships. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, Rejected: Essays on Belonging, featuring photographs by Lindsay Morris. It's available wherever you get your books. Hi, Michelle Fiordaliso. Thank you so much for coming on to Unveiling Death.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
It's a great pleasure. So you worked in an AIDS clinic in New York City at St. Vincent's Medical Center, like at the heart of the AIDS epidemic. And you were a very young woman at the time. And I'm wondering, like, of all the things one might do to be helpful at that time in our history, and it was a very intense time, and it was a very intense place, and you were like in the crucible of that, and it was sad. Um, and lots of people were helping. I mean, I knew people who were involved in ACT UP and the advocacy organization and a lot more. But you chose to do that, and that is really intense, particularly for a young person. Why, why of all things did you choose to do that?
Yes, it was an unusual choice, I would say. And this was my first job out of college. I worked at St. Vincent's, both outpatient and inpatient, from 1993 to 1995, which I didn't know at the time because I was in the midst of it. But I later, in recent years, was watching a documentary, I don't remember which one, about AIDS, and 1993 to 1995 were the 2 years that we experienced the most deaths to AIDS in this country. So it was pretty significant. There were 3 to 4 patients on my caseload that died a day. And I would follow them inpatient. I would start to see them sometimes as early as when they were getting their HIV testing and diagnosis, and then followed them into the hospital. Why did I choose that? I think that I would say that it chose me probably more than I chose it. My parents had a hair salon when I was growing up, and they had very good taste in magazines. So they had Interview magazine and all kinds of magazines for the women to look through while they were having their hair dyed. And there was Life magazine there, and there was a photo of Ken Meeks, gaunt and covered with Kaposi sarcoma. It was taken a couple of days before he died. And I saw that photo, and that's the first recollection that I have of seeing something about AIDS. I was probably about 13 at the time. And I said to my mother, I'm going to grow up and help these people. And it was one of the iconic photos of AIDS that made people understand what Kaposi sarcomas looked like, what people dying of AIDS looked like, and it chose me.
Right, right.
And so and my mother said, why would you want to do that? That's depressing. And I think a lot of people probably shared her opinion. And a lot of other people were afraid, and they were afraid for my health. And uh, but that sort of propelled the trajectory of my life from that moment on. I decided to go to social work school. My internship during social work school was also with people with AIDS. I worked at the Lighthouse, and there's a particular kind of blindness associated with AIDS. called retinitis pigmentosa. And so there I was.
Do you remember the first time you saw someone die or saw a dead person? I'm actually also thinking you were young and these people were, I assume, largely, primarily younger people too.
Yeah, the first person that I saw dead was in my childhood because I grew up Catholic and we do wakes and there's a very poorly made up body at the front of the room. So I had seen a dead body. The first time that I saw somebody die, I do remember very clearly. And the day is sort of kind of burned on my brain. I was working in the outpatient clinic, which is on the west side of 7th Avenue South, and I got called to come over to the hospital. And for anybody that's been on the corner of 12th Street and 7th Avenue in winter time, they know it can be a wind tunnel. And it was a very gray day. And I remember looking at the sky and saying, like, what a day to die on.
Hmm.
And I went up to, and this is something that was sort of interesting because his father, and to your point, yes, so these were young men who I really didn't realize how young they were. Often AZT at the time made people look very old, but these were men that were in their 20s and early 30s. And the father had been sitting, he was from the Midwest, and the father had been sitting vigil at his bed and left for a few moments to, I don't know, make a call, get a coffee, smoke a cigarette. And I saw this happen quite frequently, and I'll speak about it in a second, and I sat next to him and I kind of didn't know what to expect and just sort of breathe along with him. And and I remember that I had this vision of uh kind of like a huge bird with talons coming into the room and kind of lifting a light from his chest.
Hmm.
And if you were in St. Vincent's looks west to the Hudson River, and that I had this vision and he took his last breath and I looked to the left and there was the most vivid red sunset that I had ever seen, which, happens there occasionally. And I saw a bird fly by,
Right.
and it just felt liberating and not nearly as scary as I would have anticipated death to be. But the thing that I want to say about the father leaving in that moment is that, I mean, obviously not when somebody is shot or killed in a car accident, but I do think that the dying often have some sense of volition, because I saw it happen very frequently that someone would be sitting vigil for days and days and days. And this happened with my aunt when she died. We were there around the clock. And then that person leaves for a minute or 5 minutes, and then that's when the person dies.
Right.
And conversely, I've also seen where somebody seems like they should have died last Tuesday, and a family member or a loved one will be trying to get there from across the world, or and it seems as though the person is holding on, and then that person will walk in the room and an hour or two
Right.
later.
Yeah, exactly. So I've seen both of those things too in my work as a rabbi. And the Jewish tradition is primarily, opposed to leaving the dying person alone. And sometimes it just does not work. And I completely agree with you that there is a sense for some that they just want to be alone, although alone they were not. This young man was not alone because you were there. Um, but I want to talk about the vision. So that vision, is vision the right word for it? In other words, is it something that you feel like you saw, or is it something that you saw when you closed your eyes at that moment? Like, what was going on there at that moment?
I mean, I don't know if it was a daydream or a hallucination, or uh I really don't know. I mean,
Mhm.
sort of accepted that it was something certainly that helped me contextualize what I was experiencing in a way that was bigger than myself and this other person.
Wow. And you're, just to again put it in context, you were what, 20,
20.
20? Wow. I'm sure there's been a lot written about birds and death. You know,
Why?
why? Because it comes up a lot. It
Oh.
comes up a lot. Oh yeah, people say we just saw a cardinal and that was my loved one saying that everything's okay, like that sort of thing. Yeah. Um, so do you feel like your own, most people at 20, I hope, and I think that I'm among the exceptions, but I hope that most people at 20 are not thinking a lot about their mortality. Were you thinking, obvious, I can't imagine that you were not thinking more about your mortality at that time. And how did that experience, not just that one day, but that overall experience, seeing so much death so intimately, impact you and your understanding of your own mortality?
I think that I was much more afraid of life for a long time than of death. And so I was never really afraid of my own mortality. My mortality actually felt more like a burden. Uh, and I struggled with some significant depression and suicidal ideation in my teen years and maybe a little beyond. And and as a result, I think that uh, Ram Dass says that dying is taking off your heavy boots. And I really felt the constriction of being alive. So seeing other people die and be released, as strange as it sounds, was liberating more than devastating.
So you have among your many creative endeavors is your podcast, The When Is Now. And that's a plug for The When Is Now. And you had on there, one of your guests is your friend and the son of Elie Wiesel, Alicia Wiesel. And you and Alicia Wiesel have jumped out of planes. And you jumped out of planes together. Alicia Wiesel said something really interesting when you were talking to him on The When Is Now, which is that his fear of death, he understood from jumping out of planes with a parachute, I should say. I don't know if I made that clear. That his fear of death was not as strong as his desire to really live. He said something like, by parachuting, skydiving, he was, quote, getting the most out of life. And I get that. But I also wonder, maybe the jumping out of the plane is not overcoming the fear of death, but almost saying, hello, death. Because you're really, I can't imagine that one is not feeling that way. I have never jumped out of a plane. I have, though, flown. And when I fly, like a lot of people, you feel like I'm up in the air and I'm a little unmoored here, or completely, at least you feel that way. So, and we, some of us have those feelings, but also experiences where you're like just putting yourself in a position, not merely to sort of snub your nose at death or to say that I can do something to spite you, but rather to look in death's eye and say, hi.
Well, okay, I have a few things to say. One is that I don't do my podcast anymore. So if people want to listen to the archived ones, they are there. But listen to Jeffrey's podcast instead because it's
Oh,
more current.
mutual
I'm gonna
endorsements.
plug yours. Um, uh, I talked to Alicia about the fact that you might ask me this question, and he's sort of since clarified in his text to me that a couple of things. So I'll tell you why I did. I'll tell you what he clarified. It did definitely feel hubristic to kiss his father goodbye and say, you survived Auschwitz and we're going to go
Right.
wantonly throw our bodies out of airplanes. For me, I think, and then I would make Alicia listen to these horrible. No, some of them weren't horrible. Some of them were great. Like Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen talk about death on these cassette tapes as we drove up to the drop zone in upstate New York. For me, I think after witnessing so much death, I needed things that would immediately jolt me into the present moment. And there's nothing like jumping out of a plane to do that. Something like surfing big waves, I think also does that, lots of other things. He said, I think I also didn't want to live a life that was driven by fear. And that's something that I think I resonated with. I had a terrible fear of heights. And I said, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to jump out of airplanes until I'm not afraid to stand on the edge of an airplane with an open door at 15,000 feet and jump out of it. After a while, and I had this little ritual that I would do, there were no seats in the planes that we jumped out of. Usually we jumped out of a Twin Otter, sometimes a Cessna, and you'd be sitting on the floor kind of in between each other's legs. And I would kind of cycle through all the things that I had done in my life that were really scary to me in order to propel myself out of the door. And that was my little ritual that I did. And then eventually I sort of had the idea that you are actually supposed to be afraid of jumping out of a plane at 15,000 feet, unless you're missing an amygdala, like that guy who, climbs rocks with no ropes. It is normal to be afraid.
Does that
And
guy actually have no amygdala?
he does, he has some kind of impaired amygdala, they found out,
Oh,
which
wow.
makes him, or none or something, but
I
something
have
that
I have like the biggest amygdala.
I don't have that big of an
Almost. I
amygdala, but
don't think I do either, by the way.
I mean, the irony is that I was nicknamed by somebody Fearless Fiordaliso.
Right. Were you a parent yet?
No, I was 22. So I started jumping out of planes 2 months after I left working at the hospital.
And I'm wondering if there's a through line from St. Vincent's to the open door of an airplane. Right? Does anything connect those two desires or experiences, motivations?
It's interesting that you use the metaphor or the image of an open door. I mean, there's an open door on a plane, but I just realized I was at the Vivian Meyer exhibit at Photographica this past weekend, and she's a photographer that I really love. And one of the photographs that I felt most drawn to was a photograph of an open door. And I also bought a painting from a painter friend once, and it's a painting of an open door. And in Hollywood, which, I'm a screenwriter, and I remember having a conversation with a pretty successful screenwriter that I bumped into at a coffee shop, and he said, go through the doors that are open.
Right.
So I guess there's a resounding thing there, but I think that the through line is an open door. I mean, I can see a lot of people arguing and saying an open door on an airplane is not an invitation to me. It's I would be hiding in the corner of whatever the furthest point from the door is in the plane. But for me, the open door is sort of symbolic of whatever is in front of you, you walk in and you face. And in the hospital setting, that means that if somebody is suffering, you walk in and you be with them. And if someone is dying, you walk in and you sit with them. And if someone is, whatever is on the other side or across that threshold, that you're willing to step in and be in the space with the other person. And the same thing, I guess, with the plane. I mean, you get out the door and somehow you trust that you're gonna find your way to the ground, to terra firma. Sometimes, like in my case, that meant finding the ground with your coccyx and breaking it. But
Ouch.
I found it nonetheless. Yeah, it's a big ouch. It's a 1 year
Especially,
ouch.
that's a very painful ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Speaking of open doors, doula.
Yes,
Yes. So you are a doula,
I am.
right? Is there anything that you're not?
I'm a very terrible painter. Like if you need your living room painted, you don't want to call me. I'm really sloppy.
But apparently a painter nonetheless. So you
I
don't
can paint
you
on a canvas, but not on a wall.
uh-huh.
I'm really bad at folding a fitted sheet, like really terrible. Like I'd much rather roll it in a ball.
All
Um,
right.
I'm not very good at cleaning the top of a stove. Those things are much better done by my mother and brother.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you mentioned all that. It humanizes you. Doula is like an open door. So there are birth doulas, which we are familiar with, and there are now also death doulas. And I'm feeling that that airplane, the image of that open door of the airplane works for being a birth doula and a death doula because you're passing through it. And in both cases, there's like a lack of terra firma, which is both like beautiful and exhilarating and somehow tragic, I feel. But you noted the similarity between being a birth doula and a death doula. How are they similar? And I guess I'm really wondering, how are they similar in ways beyond merely, and I'm putting merely in air quotes, merely beyond assisting others through these most significant transitions?
I think that they are, I mean, they're obviously similar in that they are these big transitions, and they are doorways to whatever is on the other side, wherever we come from and wherever we're going to. But there are similarities in other ways, which is that, you know, the body is being asked to do something extraordinary and unknown. If you're a second or third or eighth time mother, then, you know, this is something you have memory of. But if you're a first time mother, you know, you have no idea what this is like to, you know, pass a full born, you know, in my case, an 8.5 pound child through a tiny space. And if you are dying, I have not done it yet in this lifetime, but you know, what it's like to release and relinquish uh, control of this body. And I think that for any big transition, we need a doula. We need someone to hold our hands, someone to witness us, somebody to not be too afraid of the grandeur of this transition that they are going to shy away from it.
Right, right. So I was actually thinking, right, the birth doula's primary attention is to the mother. But I was actually thinking about the child coming into the world, in other words, going through a door, and the dying person, the same person, ultimately going through a door as well, as opposed to the mother passing a child through a space.
You bring up a really interesting point that I hadn't really thought about, or I maybe have thought about, but the perspective of the child. And actually, it's not that different to what we were speaking about earlier, where I said that I think the dying have some volition. And I mean, these days we have a lot of medical interventions, but we really have no idea how the baby, how labor starts. But what they believe is that some sort of hormone is secreted from the fetus, from the infant, that activates birth. And then that would suggest that the infant also has some volition as to when they're ready to be born.
Right.
Or maybe. And I do think there is, Yeah, I mean, I think we have passed through a door before, and so maybe death doesn't need to be as scary as it is for many of us, because we've all come through some door, even if we were lifted out through a surgical hole.
Okay. You know about the game that is a great craze sweeping the nation. What song do you want to hear as you lay dying? Did we discuss
Uh,
this?
and
It's, it's
no,
like it's like as big as the hula hoop. I didn't ask you this.
really? No, you did ask me in an email,
Oh,
but
okay.
I didn't know that it was a game, and I didn't know that it was a big craze.
Oh my gosh. Michelle Fiordaliso, where have you been? Everyone's doing it.
I've been living in a hole.
Oh my gosh. You've heard of Taylor Swift?
Who? No, yes,
Yeah,
of
this
course.
this is bigger than T Swizzle. So okay. So and my caveat has been, since I started asking this question, that I don't know what my song is. So this could be, even though you're sharing it with my hundreds of thousands of listeners, um, you're not committed to this. But if you have an answer, play the game. What song do you want to hear as you lay dying?
I don't know. If you ask me today, I've been really loving this song by the Avett Brothers called We Are Loved. It's on their new album. And it really does read like a prayer or a poem, more than a song.
Mhm.
And um, and there's a line that I love in it that says, I would sing it, but everybody will probably crash their cars or something because I'm not the world's best singer. But the line is, even in tragedy, there lies divinity.
Mm, that's good. They have real poetry in those songs. So thank you so much. And Michelle Fiordaliso, I thank you so much for talking to me on this episode of Unveiling Death.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful to be here.
And thanks as always to my creative director, my editor, my progeny, Sammy Weil.